of January 3rd, 2025. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and still I rise, and still I rise, an unbought, unbossed, unafraid, liberated Democrat. I rise as an unbought, liberated, unafraid Democrat, unbought by crypto cash, unbought by the millions of dollars that the crypto industry spends to elect people to Congress so that they can have influence over legislation. Unbossed by the Cryptocrats, the people who are among the greediest when it comes to controlling money, who desire to not only avoid taxes but to evade taxes. Unbossed, unbought, and unafraid. Unafraid to speak truth to the powerful crypto industry, and unafraid to speak truth about the powerful crypto industry. You can speak truth to power by simply saying, power, there's a problem. Let's solve it. I speak truth about power because I say to power, there is a problem and you are it. So today, as a censured but not silenced, censured but not silenced member of Congress who will today speak truth not only to power but also speak truth about power. And as I do so, I will use my pointer as I customarily do, my cane. By the way, this cane is not to help me ambulate. I'm quite ambulatory. This cane is the rod and the staff that comforts me in the presence of my enemies when I don't have the protection that Congress is providing us, and I don't always have it. So today, as I speak truth, unbought, unbossed, unafraid, censured but not silenced, I want to call several things to your attention under the topic of the dangers of unregulated cryptocurrency, the dangers associated with cryptocurrency when it's not properly regulated. Let's start with the meme coins. The meme coins. If you own a meme coin, you own nothing. You have bought nothing. You have paid for nothing, and at some point, some of the owners of meme coins will get exactly what they paid for, nothing. A meme coin is a fiction that requires the person who buys initially or at some point to hope that there's another person that will buy at a higher price, and that money between the price paid for and the price you can sell for the higher price becomes your profit. Well, in the parlance of those who do much of this at a street level, that's called the greater fool theory. Buying in and believing that there's a greater fool who will come along and cover your possible losses. If you own a meme coin, you own nothing. The president is one of the great purveyors of meme coins. The president has a coin, the dollar Trump coin, and this coin he can pump up and he can dump and leave those who are part of the higher price holding the bag. The president pumps and dumps. This is a scam. I'm speaking truth about power, not just to power. Yes, Mr. President, you are the problem. You have taken advantage of many people with your scam, wherein you can make comments and tell people to come down to Mar-a-Lago Come on down. And those who have the greatest investment, you will be allowed. Those who are buying in at a cheaper level won't be allowed. Therefore, people can go out and buy so that they can be among those who will come to Mar-a-Lago. And as a result, he pumps up the value of his meme coin, which is nothing. He pumps up the value of nothing, and then at some point he can sell at this higher price and make an amount of money. This is really insider trading that is transparent. I don't think the president ought to be able to own meme coins. I don't think the cabinet should own meme coins. I don't think members of Congress should own meme coins. I think that members of Congress, the president and the cabinet, we have advantages that other people don't have. We talk to each other. The president can tell people when to buy and when to sell because he's going to pump and then dump or allow you to dump. I believe the law ought to regulate such that meme coins cannot be owned and sold by members of Congress and members of the cabinet and the president and possibly some others that I shall not name at this point. I believe that we have to properly regulate the meme coin. That's why the Cryptocrats want to get me out of Congress, because they know I fight them. I stand in the way of what they attempt to do to people who are not knowledgeable about how this can be pumped and dumped and how people can be taken advantage of. I'm in the way. Yes, come and get me. I understand it. Come and get me. Because as long as I'm here, I'm going to stay in the way. Because I want to protect the American people from this kind of insider trading, this kind of selling of nothing and being taken advantage of by those who happen to buy nothing and assume that they can sell it for something. Yes, the meme coin is a problem. And those who sell it and create it are part of the problem when it's not properly regulated. I want to call to your attention the decentralization of cryptocurrency. The Cryptocrats want to decentralize cryptocurrency so that they can have peer-to-peer transference of dollars, huge sums of dollars, untold amounts of dollars. Peer-to-peer transfers. Why is this so important to them? Because if you can transfer peer-to-peer, you can engage in tax evasion more than tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is legal. Tax evasion is illegal. You can transfer huge sums of money from one person to another without some central entity that can be there to make sure that it's properly regulated. That's what the Cryptocrats want. They want to be able to just transfer money. That way you can avoid taxes. But you can also do something else when you have this peer-to-peer transference. You can also transfer that money at a speed that is unbelievably fast. You can transfer it to a terrorist organization. It can be received by those who would do us harm, those who would disrupt our society, those who would disrupt the democracy that we cherish. Yes, the Cryptocrats are in the business of buying and selling, and they're also in the business of contributing to those who would agree with what I am antithetical to, because those who would agree what I'm antithetical to will allow them to have peer-to-peer transfers, would allow them to have meme coins that are meaningless, nothing but a thought, a fiction. I'm speaking truth about power, not just to it. Yes, decentralization without regulation is a problem. And of course, the Cryptocrats, whether wittingly or unwittingly, are moving in the direction of creating something akin to the demise of the almighty dollar. The demise of the almighty dollar. Cryptocrats would, if they could, have cryptocurrency become the preeminent currency. There's a war for currency supremacy going on across the globe. The dollar is the supreme currency across the globe. It is the reserve currency of choice across the globe. The cryptocrats would have the cryptocurrency become the currency of choice. Use the cryptocurrency. Use it, and you don't have to have it go through some centralized location. Just transfer your money like you please. In fact, if they had their way, cryptocurrency would be tantamount to banks. They would have unregulated banks. And the sad thing about what I've just said is that the banks don't know who their friends are. They don't know who their friends are. They don't understand, it seems, that there are some of us who are fighting this. They don't seem to understand that. Well, I can tell you this. I'm going to protect the American banking system, whether the banks will join in and help or not. I'm going to protect the American banking system because in so doing, I'm protecting the American dollar. And so doing, I'm helping to protect American democracy to a certain extent. Because if the banking system fails, people lose trust. They lose trust in the economy. That impacts the democracy in the sense of we've allowed people to be placed into office that would facilitate this decentralized transference of money. I am opposed to it. And I'm going to protect the banks in this country, a system that has functioned. It has allowed the dollar to be the supreme currency of choice globally. We have to protect the American dollar. I'm going to do that. The cryptocrats, if they had their way, they would own every member of Congress. Every member. But there are some who resist. I am a part of the resistance. As a matter of fact, I may be at the tip of the spear of the resistance, a part of the avant-garde. I am the resistance to a certain extent. There are others, but I assure you, I am going to remain the architect of some portion of this resistance as long as I'm in Congress. And therein is the operative phrase for the cryptocrats. He said, as long as he's in Congress. Well, if we just get him out of Congress, we don't have him to contend with. Well, you can do that, but there are others who will follow. There are others who are already in the fight. They're there. But I can assure you of this. I'm going to fight you to the bitter end. Until my last days, I will fight what I see as a demise of the dollar, a peer-to-peer transference of money such that you can avoid taxes, the creation of nothing and selling it as something. This is the epitome of ridiculosity to allow such things to occur and not challenge them. I assure all who listen, I'm going to protect your wallet. There are people who say they want to put more money in your wallet. Well, I'm going to protect your wallet and make sure that you can get money in your wallet and not allow people to cleverly disguise themselves as persons who want to regulate when in fact they just want to pass something under the guise of regulation so that the cryptocurrency, the cryptocrats, can continue to move in the direction of dominance with the cryptocurrency, the crypto dollars, as it were. This is not something that we should take lightly, and I do not. I want to assure you that I am censured but not silenced. And I also want to assure you of something else. The countdown to impeachment continues. Because what the president has done as it relates to wars, relates to pumping and dumping, which I've explained earlier, and as it relates to his disrespect for the Constitution of the United States of America, he's done things that are clearly impeachable. It's just a matter of time, Mr. President. Your day will come. Someone is going to stand in the well of the House of Representatives and read articles of impeachment to remove you from office. It would be the thing that this country should do so as to prevent another cryptocrat such as yourself. Yes, the president is a cryptocrat. To prevent another cryptocrat such as yourself from assuming power. We have to protect American democracy from the cryptocrats. We've already had a former vice president to say that this president is a great threat to the republic. I think he said the greatest threat to the republic. President Donald John Trump. Threat to the republic. Threat to democracy. Cryptocracy is his main concern, it seems, because there's a family business that he's brought to the White House. And they are using this family business to make billions of dollars at the expense of unsuspecting Americans and people of other stripes as well. But I am censured, not silenced, and I'm engaging in a countdown to impeachment. I know that there are people who want to know when. It will happen when it happens. And I assure you it's going to happen. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the time. And I'm proud to say that I'm Al Green, the OG Al Green. Unbought, unbossed, unafraid, uncontrolled by the cryptocrats. I yield back the balance of my time.